that literally put a man on the moon. And when you say 5 billion people are going to have access to smartphones, what you're saying is 2/3 of humanity are going to be walking around the world with a supercomputer in their pocket. And when you have a supercomputer in your pocket, you have the ability to see how other people live. You have the ability to instantly get information from all kinds of sources. You have the ability to cheaply communicate with people that you admire and share ideas and empathy and stories and brainstorming in very, very powerful ways. And you know, and just stop and think about what I'm about to say for a second, because it sounds almost cliched in it, but stop and really consider what I'm saying. I mean, it means that essentially all of world's knowledge is at our fingertips essentially for free. All of the world's knowledge is at our fingertips essentially for free. And when you have these kinds of power, you have the ability to problem solve and innovate and come up with ideas in your backyard ever before. And so in a way, the biggest takeaway about technology is not so much about technology, but what it enables. And the biggest story of this book is that problems and solutions and innovation are happening at, I think, mass scale, bottom up. And most of the institutions that we know and most of the institutions that the students are thinking about going into, whether they be in business or in the public sector, are by definition top down. And this is a profound change.
And so just following on that, as you mentioned and I had mentioned in my introduction, you worked in the government back in the George H.W. Bush administration. There was some technological change that had occurred at that point, but not what we've seen since then. How do you think government officials have to go about their jobs differently, have to think differently because of the changes that have taken place? What would it mean if you were in the State Department today in the kind of position you were in 20 years ago? You know, how would you have to be thinking differently about what you were doing?
You know, I've said to people that when I was in the State Department, actually, that it prepared me for the internet more than any job I had done up until that point, and they don't believe me. And I can assure you that has nothing to do with management practices and the bureaucracy, which was stunning then and seems to be stunning today. And it sure as hell wasn't about technology. I had a 1990 Wang computer, I think. It's a big box of a thing. It was just unbelievable. But what happened in the time I was there, you know, was that pretty much the premise of almost everything in the world that I thought my grandchildren would be dealing with turned on its ear in 18 months, right? I mean, this is, in those days, Latin America was a mess, and all of a sudden it was consolidating in very, very interesting ways. Of course, Gorbachev came, and the Berlin Wall came down. Mandela was released. I mean, you just make a list. Tiananmen Square, Chinese in the square, quoting Jefferson. I mean, it was just this amazing sort of juxtaposition that convinced me that what I said earlier is just true, that we are in worlds where there are these spikes of great uncertainty that you have to be able to run with, because that's really what the world is about. It's not about all things being equal, and that was going to change. And technology, at one level, not only puts that on steroids because of the speed with which it moves, but at the same time, again, has this bottom-up effect that I described before, which changes the dynamics. And so the direct answer to your question from my experience, and I don't spend too much time with government, but as you can imagine, being here in Washington, I get brought in a lot, and people ask me questions like that. And I'm cautious about analogy, but I'll tell you, I mean, in some respects, it almost reminds me of the early days of World War I. And what I mean by that is that those of you who are scholars of the period know that the technology, the military technology, simply was well beyond the reach of the decision-making. It just was moving faster and had different ramifications than the mindset and the cultures and the institutions that had to figure out what to do with it. And what I'll tell you, that across the board, with very little exception, what is happening technologically in the world, bottom up, with this amazing access to software, the institutions that I deal with don't know how to deal with it. And again, I don't want to belabor it or go down any rabbit holes, but there's no way on earth, this is not a partisan statement about what I'm saying, there's no way on earth that software in this day and age should have been released like the software in the health exchanges that just came out. That should be an impossibility in 2013. And I think actually the story behind the story, that has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with how government is actually doing a 1995 version of procurement in an age which no longer, it's no longer tenable.
Let's turn our attention to some of the characters in the book, some of the folks who are really making this difference on the ground throughout the region. You talk about sort of different types, improvisers, problem solvers, yeah, global players. Can you elaborate on what these different categories are?
You know, I'm sure that you see this in the university setting a lot, but the book editors really push you to block things up. And so it's a little bit frustrating because I did do my Tom Friedman version of putting things into buckets, which life is never that clean. But in terms of the entrepreneurs, I did describe them as the improvisers, I call them the problem solvers, and the global players. And again, tremendous overlap. The improvisers is a pretty well-known phenomenon. In fact, it makes sense in emerging growth markets at all, which is to effectively take something which has been successful elsewhere and then bring it to your market, both in terms of language, but not just language. It's not just copycatting, but it's being sensitive to the dynamics of the market and all. And so it should be no surprise that the first, what we call in the business, exit, the first acquisition of an Arab technology software startup was a company called Maktub, which was the Yahoo of the Middle East that actually got bought by Yahoo, in fact. And one of my favorite companies today, it's a juggernaut of a company, is Souq.com, which is kind of the Amazon of the Middle East. And so that happens, right? I mean, if you think about the largest software companies in China, you know, you've got Alibaba and you have Baidu, which is a big search engine. One of the biggest IPOs in Russia in the last 10 years was Yandex, which is the search engine. So it's interesting because people criticize that, but I think it's an obvious first step in emerging growth markets. As one of the entrepreneurs said to me, imagine if an Arab kid 4 or 5, 6 years ago came home and said, Dad, I'm leaving college because I got this great idea for something called Facebook. How awesome is this? And I'm going to blow off school, and I'm going to build this social network, and 600 million people are going to come around the world. His father would have threatened to throw him out of his house. The school would have never allowed him to do it. I mean, and so this improviser, I actually think, is a very healthy early stage in an ecosystem that's building. In some respects, the most moving, but also really impressive group of entrepreneurs is, I would call, the problem solvers. And I think this is a phenomenon that I see in investments in the United States as well, but is clearly global and absolutely clear in a place like the Middle East, where young people are effectively saying that problems that people my age or older think of as infrastructure problems or government problems are in fact software problems. So any of you who've been to Cairo, you know the traffic there makes Los Angeles look like an open desert. It's very complicated. You say at the end of the day that someone at some point has got to build a new road system. That's a generation if it happens at all. Young people say, you know something? I'm going to build a crowd-sharing app so that we can navigate traffic better, and we're going to have 1 million people use it, and we'll get the best routes, and we'll just work around it. Easily 15%, in my observation, of the startups that I've seen in Egypt are education. Now, you guys know, some of you will know this much better than I do, but the amount of money per capita spent on education in the Middle East is actually shockingly high for the result, higher than even some places in Asia, but in a per capita basis. But it is just poorly, terribly spent. You know about the illiteracy and the problems in the rural areas, but even in the urban areas, you have classrooms of 70 kids. They're teaching rote learning to a curriculum that is 10, 20 years old, and so it's not for the 21st century. And the biggest evidence that you have of this, and think about the number I'm about to use, is that in Cairo alone, it's somewhere between a $2 or $3 billion industry to get supplemental education or tutoring, which tells you a lot about the way people there spend. But it also tells you that the wealthy people are getting the tutoring and a lot of people are not. So what does a young person say when it's a software problem? I'm going to build a Khan Academy in Arabic of courses that are crowd shared where people can come at any age, at any value, and at no price, and come in and effectively go onto this platform and get supplemental math and supplemental learning in these amazing ways. So there's one company called Nafam, which already has, it's been up and running less than a year, it has 10,000 crowdsourced basic math and writing skills online in Arabic. It's got millions of users who have come to it from all ages. And you know, I think it's an interesting question about how much of the stuff that's bubbling up underneath will actually replicate or really solve the education challenge. History will have to show it out. But it sure as hell is an opportunity that we would not have been able to talk about 5 years ago. The last group is what it sounds like what it is, which is the global players, which is that you have a lot of young people who just wake up in the morning and say, the entire world is one click away. And so I remember I was being pitched at a startup competition in Cairo. It's a great entrepreneur. This young guy was just totally tenacious and very smart. And it built what is one of the highest selling paid apps in weather, a beautiful thing. And he was starting describing it and pitching it, and I looked down on my iPad, and I realized I had downloaded it 6 months earlier, having no idea that it was 30 young people in Alexandria, Egypt. And so there's a whole series of entrepreneurs who literally day one might be leveraging their local experiences, but they think the world is their oyster. And so that really is the spectrum of what you see.
And then, you know, many of us have stereotypes about the role of women in these societies, about the opportunities that are available to women in these societies. Many of your entrepreneurs are women. They're doing some incredibly interesting things. And some of them are quite young. You tell the story, and I want you to tell this story of these 16-year-old girls in Yemen who faced a problem with respect to kerosene fires in tents, and they found a solution. So I want you to tell everybody what
in a way, it's one. I have no favorite entrepreneurs, but it is in a way my favorite story because it captures so much of the dynamic in a nutshell overall. And it ties a little bit to my previous conversation about education. So there's an amazing organization called Injaz Al Arab. And Injaz Al Arab is a little bit like the Junior League there, but it's been around for 10 or 15 years. And it's fundamentally doing education programs about entrepreneurship all over the Arab world. Literally millions of kids have come through this, and maybe they do 30 or 40,000 students a year. Just, I mean, it's teaching the basics, right? This is not high-tech stuff necessarily. It's assets and liabilities and P&L things and just how to think about what a business is and all. So every year, to your story, they have a startup competition, which is one of the most fun things I have done over there, where these young people come in from every country. They represent their country. They've been chosen by their country in a competition. They've got their flags and often will dress, of the tradition of their country. And there's a big room beforehand where you can see what they've built, and you talk to these young people, and their lights are on, and they're all high school kids. So to your story, these young, self-described science geeks from Yemen in a community near where they lived, which was a tent community, is a tent community, they're kerosene lamps. That's the only, there's no electricity there. And of course, fires is the #1 hazard, as Jim said. And they're like, in this day and age, this is ridiculous. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a solar capability of a charging station and then begin to replicate the kerosene lamps with electrical lamps and everything else. And that's what they did. They built these solar-powered areas and charging stations where people could become, and they negotiated to have the things come in and all. All right, so very impressive, very interesting, 15, 16-year-old, 5 women. But then someone asked them, but where'd you get the solar panels? I don't understand it. Like, did some NGO give it to you or the government? Where'd you get the solar panels? And the girls didn't skip a beat. Said, oh, we built them. He said, what do you mean you built them? He said, yeah, go online. There are YouTube videos or all these different places you go to. You know, it literally just search, like, I should do this. I've never done this. But they said search, solar panels and materials near you or whatever. And it said it took them 10 months, but they got them to work, and they're working. And another young woman sticks up her hand and said, yeah, and we built these little solar things which we can put in umbrellas so the women who walk around with umbrellas can have fans put in them. And, they're just firing off ideas at each other all the time. And needless to say, they won the competition.
And then the last question I ask, and then we're going to open it up. Dean's discussion doesn't mean Dean gets to hog the discussion. So we are actually going to open it up to let you ask your questions. But I just want to ask you a question about the continuing role of Silicon Valley. There's been a lot of talk about sort of the things that made it possible for Silicon Valley to be Silicon Valley, and we've seen other countries say, oh, we want to have our own Silicon Valley. We're going to try to replicate what made it possible to have Silicon Valley. When I read your book, I'm seeing all sorts of things taking place that have nothing to do with being in Silicon Valley or being in a Silicon Valley type place. Like, for example, the type of Silicon Valley-like entity that the Russians have been looking to create. So what is the continuing role of Silicon Valley, and then how do these other things that are going on either become their own Silicon Valleys, or is that even the wrong way to think about the issue?
Well, I think Silicon Valley is an interesting analogy, and by the way, there have been lots of things written about why Silicon Valley is the way that it is, and there are lots of debates around people about it. I have to tell you that a book that came out in the late 90s is still the best book I've ever read on this subject. And think about it, this was right before the internet. It's called Regional Advantage. A great professor wrote it, and it was actually comparing Silicon Valley to Route 128 in Boston. So the question is, how did Silicon Valley rise? How did Route 128 be such a wonderful, huge ecosystem that actually arguably settled down well below it and all? And it raises a lot of very, very interesting questions. And where I sort of come out in thinking about it is a couple things. Around every great city, Washington, hubris reigns. And so there's a lot of hubris in and about places like Silicon Valley. But at the same time, I would argue that in world history, there haven't been 3 urban centers like it. It's a mind blow. The caliber of talent there, the ideation, the exploration of big ideas is truly not cliched, but extraordinary. And I think one of the things that Silicon Valley really has become, among other things, is that it's a network effect, meaning the more people come, the more people want to come, of the best talent in the world. I mean, it really is. And so if you're a world-class engineer, you duke it out to be there, and you don't even want to go to Los Angeles or San Diego. There is a sort of effect that physically that it is there, and it's therefore extraordinary, and it is. There's a reason why that really pretty much every piece of global software at scale that's been created up until now is still built in Silicon Valley, even though some hardware obviously has been built in Korea and Japan and other wonderful places. I think this will actually change and evolve, to your question. because the power of what's been built in Silicon Valley is now so distributed. And I think what a lot of us who are a little bit older don't really fully appreciate is it really works, right? I mean, it's not like 5, 10 years ago, the software worked and it was wonderful, but you got glitches all the time. And now it's unbelievable, the facility with which it works, which means that, back to my 5 billion smartphone things, when more people have software that works, the more that they're starting to bubble up really, really interesting ideas and to build upon it. And the fact of the matter is, you know, often and historically we've said that global markets effectively mean the American market because it's so big. But remember, in a world of 5 billion smartphones, you're talking about communities of billions of people who were not part of the ecosystem before, who are about to become part of the ecosystem now, which is a very, very profound change. So I actually spent 2 weeks in Silicon Valley interviewing some of my best friends out there, to be very blunt about how they think about rising emerging markets, why they've invested in some and not others, and everything else. And it was just a fascinating conversation because at one level, it was consistently me focused. So why do you go into an emerging market? Well, I'm going to go into an emerging market if it's so big I have to be there. So I may lose a lot of money in China for a while, but it's so big I'll make money one day. Me. I will go into India because I can outsource cheaply. And if the market allows me to do things I'm doing now cheaper, I'm going to move it to another market, me. And so I asked my friends, so what happens when innovation happens elsewhere? And what happens when people don't want to leave what they're doing? And they said, well, if they're that good, they'll come to Silicon Valley. And I said, this is not what I'm seeing. Because in the Middle East in particular, in my experience, there is a feeling not only I'd like to be home because I'd like to be near my family, I'd like to be home because I'd like to be part of my culture, but almost a national mission that things are changing so elaborately. So much fear of the old laws and rules have been taken away that folks are like, I might like to visit Silicon Valley. I'd certainly like a business development relationship to help distribute products globally, but I'd love to be able to stay at home. So whether there'll be another Silicon Valley anywhere else, I actually doubt it anywhere. New York has risen great, but it's not Silicon Valley, yet New York is unbelievable. Washington has an ecosystem in some areas, and medium-sized cities, even the United States, have really interesting things that are coming. I think we're going to be seeing pockets of innovation all over the world now. I think that's going to be the story. There'll be Silicon Valley, it'll still be something in my lifetime, and then we're going to have surprising innovation coming from pockets of the world because they've got the ability to do it and they're proud of being where they are, and these markets are going to become very large. And I think, frankly, Americans in our hubris have to stop thinking about me, and have to think about co-authorship. People know more about their markets than we know, and that's something that should be shared. People who have never known a landline might have something to teach us about mobile technology, maybe. And there are things that we know that we can teach, but that becomes a co-authorship, a collaboration. And if you see anything else, if you go through the Middle East now, and this is true in other emerging markets, and it's been true here for a while, is that one of the greatest things is arising, as cities have grown so important, is a rise of shared workspace. Think about the terminology I'm using, shared workspace. We are a sharing opportunity now. And anyone who comes at it in that spirit, I think, is going to be a big winner going forward. And anyone who thinks that we're in the idea of monopoly and protection are playing a game that is being totally disaggregated by the bottom up, right? The bottom up affects government institutions, but the bottom up is affecting all institutions.
Well, that's a great message for this school. One of the things I do as I go around the country and even to other parts of the world, meeting with alumni of the School of International Service, and of course, one of the first things I always ask the alumni is, you know, what do you remember about your SIS experience? What has stuck with you? What was the best course you took? The answer almost uniformly is their course in cross-cultural communication.
Wow.
And many of them have said to me, whatever field they're in, you know, a banker at Wells Fargo in San Francisco, a lawyer down in Los Angeles, they say to me, I am better at my job than my colleagues because I got that training in cross-cultural communication at SIS, and I have some idea how to interact with people from other parts of the world, how to negotiate with people from other parts of the world. And it's something we're very proud of in our curriculum here. So with that, I'm going to open it up to the folks here. We've got microphones going around. If you could just introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Saad Shaker from Silicon Valley. So thank you for a great talk. And I really like your perspective on really shifting away from the stereotype to the real spirits in the Middle East. And I have a special message from you from a good friend of yours, Dina Shaker, who's my daughter, actually. And You guys worked together, yeah. And she actually just texted me, said, make sure you tell him I said hi. They worked together at the State Department, and she is
I wasn't in the state, but she was.
She was. And she's at Silicon Valley now
She's
after
at Google now.
2
She's
years.
unbelievable.
She's at Google. So
She's a leader of this from the United States perspective. As a
well, she
wonderful
spoke
bridge.
so
She's
highly of
unbelievable.
you that I really had to come and see you.
I'm honored.
And I wish my phone ran out of charge, but I was recording you to send to Dina.
Okay.
She's attending a wedding in Philadelphia, so she's not too far away. So thank you so much.
Wow, thank
Just a comment.
That's awesome. Thank you.
No, I'm Dina's mom, by the way. When I was, and I was at a conference that she's part of on the board of Tekwadi, which
Yeah,
is,
of course.
and it is really. I was amazed myself, coming from my origin from the Middle East, what they have brought in to Silicon Valley. One of the new inventor of this app that takes the bugs out of the apps came from Egypt. He was sitting right next to me, 21 years old.
Instantly,
And
awesome.
now it's being bought millions and millions of dollars by this high-tech company. So there's a lot of talent there, and there's a lot of brain there. And although this guy had built this app through power outage, through all the turmoil that's going on there, and he was able to do it. So there is a lot of brains there. We just
And so she's a couple of things that just to let you know, because this is unbelievably important what they're saying. Tekwadi is this amazing group in Silicon Valley that's actually, they're Egyptians who've been very successful here but have remained very connected to Silicon Valley, and they've built a platform of connection and bridge building between Silicon Valley and the entire Arab world. So it's not just Egypt, though there is obviously some of it there, and frankly, Egypt is an amazing thing. And so this is a perfect example, and has really taken on a new life post the uprisings, which I'm incredibly hopeful for, and the founders of it are amazing, and the young people they brought in now I think is a phenomenon overall. But the second thing they said, which is important, because a lot of times people think about, when power outages go out and there's political instability, I mean, look, these are very serious issues, right? I mean, ecosystems matter, rule of law matters, electricity matters, and then some of the most wonderful entrepreneurs I met were Syrians, right? And I met them right before all the hell broke loose, right? What I'm saying, which is so hopeful, does not dismiss the realities of other things, but what she also just said was that when you have challenges, you learn to work things around. And the definition, I can tell you of 20 years of doing this, the definition of a great entrepreneur is a woman or man who just walks through walls to make things happen. And every challenge they come, they figure out a way to solve that challenge, and in that challenge is opportunity. And so the guys like from Instabug and others, who have effectively just said, I've got this problem, I've got this challenge, but I'm going to fix it. I'm going to work around. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to work around. And they're faced a very interesting challenge because there are folks in Silicon Valley who want them in Silicon Valley because they're that good. And there's a part of them that wants to remain connected in Cairo. So it's going to be interesting to see how they play out, but they're wonderful entrepreneurs.
Great, yeah, we'll go over here. We'll take one after the other.
Hi, my name is Celine Her. I'm class of 94 here. Actually, can you hear me without
Here, no, use the mic because for
Because they're
people who are
taping.
watching.
Oh, okay. Sorry, people.
Hey.
So from my secondhand experience in Turkey and entrepreneurship, as well as my observation, I still find that both foreign but more so domestic investors prefer to go towards e-commerce sites or anything with a proven, return on investment, and that the smaller startups and those that may represent civil society type of organizations are still being left out. And I think in the MENA region, where civil society organizations are still struggling to evolve and gain traction, that I kind of find this gap between not just financial but just investment, but also mentorship, et cetera, going into what's needed in the region. And what was your observations?
There's a wonderful quote that I got from, I can't remember, it was an investor, I think, who said, the good news about the Middle East is we have the money. The bad news about the Middle East is it's in our pocket. And I think this is a very real issue. And even over the period, the limited period and the limited purview that I had over there, a couple of things seem fairly clear to me. One is that, there's been a tradition. Let me talk business first and let me talk civil society. Secondly, though, I think there's some connection to this phenomenon. So there's been some tradition for some time of private equity, i.e. investors who are investing in cash flow businesses that are doing, have a certain size and scale to them. What has been a new thing over the last couple of years, which has grown interestingly, is what we call the angel round, which is companies just getting off the ground. In this country, maybe raising $250,000 or $500,000. Over there, a lot less money is needed. you can get a company off the ground for 10, 20, 30, $50,000. And investors are beginning to show up. Among other things is because there's a younger set of entrepreneurs like Sami Tukan at Maktub who now have some money, right? And two really interesting things happen with that. One is you can put that money back to work into other entrepreneurs. But secondly, when a company gets large enough and it's successful, at some point it spawns off other entrepreneurs who then have a track record by which they can raise money. So it's sort of a loop that we're in the earliest days of. Having said that, what I can tell you, again, first on the business side, is that when some of these young companies do really, really well and they're ready for the next round of money, which could be $1 million or $2 million to take it to the next part, it's really hard. That's true in Turkey, and it's absolutely true in the Arab world. So what happens? A couple of things. I know right now people who are raising what we call an A-round fund, which is just this. And so there are people who know that there's some really good companies of scale and size, and that's going to be coming, I think, overall. Some of the Western investors are putting their fingers and toes into Istanbul first, and a couple of early stage investors have even looked at Jordan now as early stages of this. But you know, in the instability in the region and all, there's still going to be some conservatism about that. Naspers in South Africa, you know, there's this wonderful woman named Linda Rotenberg who runs a group called Endeavor Global. So they're awesome, by the way. I know them. But Endeavor Global is the largest nonprofit for entrepreneurship around emerging markets. And she has this wonderful phrase she calls E to E, emerging market to emerging market. And I think we're seeing that coming in. Operating companies are investing. So you have Vodafone has a little venture capital fund. But there's nowhere near enough yet. And this actually is a chilling thing because the opportunity is large and it is needed. And the flywheel of success breeding success hasn't quite hit the point, but people are working at it all over the place. So it'll be interesting to watch. In terms of the civil society part of it, finding funding is tough. But I will say, if I might, just as a small pitch, you know, there's some amazing efforts starting. Adina can tell you about many others in what I'll call corporate social responsibility. Not just a PR thing, but really believing that they can use their assets and skills and capability and mentorship and money to help build society bottom up. And the one that blew me away more than anything else is one called Ruwad, which in fact was formed by this amazing entrepreneur who's very important in the book, named Fadi Gondor, who founded Aramex, which is effectively the FedEx of the Middle East. Very successful company. But from the beginning, and before it was successful, he was always thinking about ways there was interactions between society and building society and business world. Ruwad, which is created in one of the poorer refugee camps in one of the hills of Amman, Jordan, is unlike anything that I've ever seen. It is a community center, like many community centers you've seen, beautifully, eloquently equipped, libraries, ancillary tutoring, insight for mothers with children, but it is of the community and by the community. So some money may come in, but this is not just a philanthropy, let's get a handout. You cannot participate in Ruwad if you don't give back to Ruwad. So it builds a sense of community by now over 1,000 members who are giving into it. One of the things that blew me away as much as anything, and is a good example about its uniqueness, is on Saturdays it has a gathering fundamentally of the adolescents of the community they call Dardashad. And it's 3 or 4 hours where they do case studies effectively, it's probably the best way to describe it, of just day-to-day interactions. Literally, a woman walks down a street, a man makes an inappropriate gesture, stop. How do you think about that? Women in the room, how are you feeling about that? Men, what were you thinking when you did this? How would you have felt if it was your sister? And they break into subgroups, and they have these, I can't speak Arabic, but you just sit there and watch this thing, and it's in a mind blow of engagement and of voice, and of a sense of what does it mean to have expectation not only within the community, but eventually be able to have steps that might be able to take you outside of the community. So there are things like this, which I think are unbelievable and very interesting to watch if they continue to scale. Ruwad in particular is now moving throughout the region, and I know the other efforts that are coming up from other businesses, and you know, they feel at one level like drops in the water in the ocean, but oceans start this way, and it's very powerful. And the one pitch that I'll make is that as you leave, please buy this book. In fact, buy many of them, because among other things, they make wonderful gifts. But I'm giving all of my proceeds to Ruwad, and so it's a very good effort of a cycle of things that can happen in powerful ways.
Woman in the green, I promised you'd have the next question.
So my name is Katie. My question actually will probably overlap on this a bit, or more than a bit. But what I'm wondering is sort of, as we stand here now, talking about the challenges, what do you see as the main challenges to innovation, entrepreneurship just exploding? Because I know it's on track, but what do you see as the main challenges to that at the moment? And then from an outsider's perspective and the rest of the world, how can we, especially from a bottom-up perspective, because I think that that's key, but how can we help to facilitate that and break down the walls that are like there right now? What can we do?
These are all unbelievable questions, by the way. You guys just are asking great questions. Let me go with the second one first, in a way. So I think that generally speaking, the best thing that folks can do who care about this stuff is to go. I think there's no substitute. If there's a region that matters to you, or if there's if it is about the Middle East, go. And you can go for all the touristy reasons to go, and you can go and see a lot of traditional institutions, but I would encourage you to go out of the box, because there's not a city on earth where the kinds of things that I'm seeing here in the Arab world, things like this are not happening as well. And your ability to not only connect with, meet, and see physically people like you who will seem very similar to you, and the minute you start problem solving with them, you'll realize in many respects you're almost the same people. I mean, it was actually a Silicon Valley guy who said this in my book, but I actually find it more broadly true. But what he said was, it's been amazing to me as I go around the world that if you get in the room, a room of true entrepreneurs, they are the same people. They solve problems the same way, they brainstorm the same way, their view that all you have to do is keep working around stuff, that we don't spend a lot of time wringing our hands about bad things, is a complete universal. By the nature of your question, by your nature of being here, and by what interests you, I'm telling you there are 1,000 of you in different cultures who are thinking about these issues in very powerful ways. And there's no better way to do it than to see them. There's a lot that can be done online, but there really is no substitute for the touch and the sense of co-authorship that is built for no other reason than you cared enough to show up. In terms of breaking down the walls, I have a bias on this subject. I've sort of given up trying to break down other people's walls. I just think at the end of the day that what's happening bottom up, you should just do bottom up and let the dice of destiny roll where it is. Jim mentioned in passing I worked in the online news business, which I adored, every aspect of it, except that I spent 30% of my time having to convince folks who had one mindset about how to do business about where things were going. And I made a determination out of that experience I was not going to do that again. I was going to be with people who were simply looking at things on their own terms and trying to come up with the best solutions. Now, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. Maybe more often than not, they don't work. But it's a different mindset. I'm not in the business of trying to persuade. I'd like to be in the business of doing. And that's actually a really big decision note I think a lot of folks, you students, have to think about. Because there is a reality that in these institutions that you love and frankly could use you, you have to make a decision whether or not you want to be kind of an intrapreneur, help reshape the organization, break down the things so they can become more equipped, or just go right to the source and decide you're going to do it. And both have value, by the way. Don't take what I said as a negative about the institutions, just take it as a personal preference in that area. Now, in terms of innovation around the world, it is incredibly important to underscore that I think governments around the world are making choices that have huge ramifications on whether or not the cars of their economy and their business innovation go 150 miles an hour or 20. I had a very interesting conversation with the dean of the Harvard Business School, who was my professor, and it's probably taught me more than almost any one man out there in many different ways. And he said, it's an interesting question about if you're China and the car is going 150 miles an hour, and you try to rein in some of this technology, but you're going 120 miles an hour, can it work? Might it be able to work? I candidly think over time it will not, because I think these things being unleashed are uncontainable. But it's a provocative question. When I was in the State Department, no one believed that China could have economic growth if it didn't have political liberalism. No one. No one thought that you would have 8 to 10% growth per year in a country that did not embrace Jeffersonian democracy, right? So it's an interesting world, and nothing's that black and white or that easy. But net, I think that by definition, if you open this up to any degree, people never go back, and it demands transparency. The thing that scares me in some respects as I look at my experience in the Middle East is these cars are not going 150 miles an hour. And if a car is going 30 miles an hour and you're hoping to get it to 70 and you take it down to 15, then you ask yourself, will a generation ever catch up? And among other things, a new generation innovating is the most mobile generation in the history of woman and mankind. And good talent will go to where they can succeed. So this is a very, very central issue, very concerning, with all the upside potential but real downside potential, and I have no crystal balls.
go over here. I'll give you two a chance. In fact, why don't we take two? We'll take them both. And
Yeah,
then,
it's a good idea.
Thank you. It's Dana Marshall. I'm an alum of the White House and State Department, among other things. And part of that work has been in sort of traditional economic development. One thing I wanted to ask you about is all that you're talking about is obviously very promising, exciting, and all of that. But what about the needle? Is it moving? In your mind, for those who are not going to be developing the apps, maybe not at this cutting edge that we're focusing on, but that middle, the people that need the jobs to get the stability, how does all that you're talking about impact what are, after all, the bulk of people in any society, and certainly in the Middle East?
and then we'll take the other
Great
question.
question also.
Hi, my name is Nick Bodeker. I'm a excuse me, a master's student here at SIS in the Social Enterprise Program. I took a class last year called the Peace Through Entrepreneurship and Global Business Practicum, in which we were working directly with Tunisian entrepreneurs to help them write their business plans. And I was wondering if you had thoughts on or any experience with how universities and students can kind of better help to build this ecosystem of entrepreneurship, especially in the Arabic world.
The question, I'll go in reverse order too, because in a way your question connects right to the predecessor questions, which is go. I mean, you can do a ton. It's absolutely a ton. I mean, what you find in these ecosystems that are just beginning to be built or wrestling a lot of different things in the nascent stage is they need money, as was pointed out, which is very important. But they need everything, right? And so every kind of support, any kind of connection, anything that you can bring to the table, again, with a spirit of co-authorship, right? This is not about patting people on the heads and showing them the way. This is about, frankly, being incredibly quiet and asking lots of questions and ascertaining where their needs are and where your needs are, and to see what kind of cross connections you can make. But it truly, I can tell you this, I mean, from an older guy's perspective in this, people would love my money, but they really do want mentorship, and they want co-authorship and brainstorming and shared experiences in very, very powerful ways. And so there are many organizations that facilitate this. You may be a social entrepreneur and you'll create one. You have friends from your college days all over the country doing really interesting stuff that you are able to tap into to make impact here. I have found stunningly that when I've gone to my friends and have told them what I've seen and what I've learned, and there's no money in them for this particular thing, but would they be willing to meet with someone, that 99 out of 100 times they're thrilled, and 99 out of 100 times afterwards, they call me up afterwards and thank you for this, and maybe 20 out of 100 times an ongoing connection is established. I mean, it's amazing to see what just happens when good people know good people, and start with a question. Like, this is, I'm really getting old. It starts with the question of what can I do for you, right? I mean, so much, business school 20 years ago was really, what do you do for me? And in the end, you want to make money and you want to make your ambitions succeed or whatever it is. But it's unbelievably powerful to me, particularly in the world that we're in and the technology that is available to it, that when you start with a premise of how can I be of help, they want to be of help, and you have a whole different kind of conversation. And your relationships, your instinct, your experience, your passion, their instinct, their relationships, their passion, they're working around things on the ground. It's just an amazing, it's an explosive combination in my view. So, but it goes back to what I said before. You got to go. You just got to go. There's no substitute for it. So what's so interesting about your question is it's a real question. And one level, I come back at it and say that I interviewed a whole bunch of economists, and I've looked at a lot of data. And one of the essence questions is that there's a youth bubble in this region. We talk about middle class or people in the middle. But the reality is there's a lot of young people, 50% under the age of 25 in some of these countries kind of thing. So what does technology mean to so many of these people who may not even have basic skills? It's a huge question. But I can tell you in talking to these economists and other folks, no one has persuaded me or shown me an ounce of data of how existing businesses and government practices are going to absorb a fraction of it either. It is a two-edged sword, because at one level, I would almost rather have that youth bubble problem than the Japan problem of an aging population. But it still begs the question, what will you do with the youth? And what is so exciting to me about the technology aspect of this, and I want to come back to technology in a second as part of it, is that it allows so many individuals to take control of their own things and be able to create both economic and social perspectives in ways that they never could do it before. And I think that this happens a lot, and I think we do this here a lot in particular, which is that we get hung up on technology. This town gets hung up on technology, right? As well, after the healthcare thing, maybe it should. But what I'm saying is that there's a sense, and here's something I would leave with the students in particular, right? I mean, we're narrative animals. I started this thing by saying, but we're also bucketers, right? So there's the politics guys, and there are the policy women, and there are the PhD people, and there are the business people who are slightly evil, and then there's the technology people, and I can't really say what I mean, but the fact is it's all part and parcel of very similar things. So there's long been a tradition outside of Cairo of women doing, for example, craft businesses, just to make a little bit of extra money, keep busy during the day, and everything else. These are not women on Facebook yet. But what was so interesting to me when I went to meet with some of them is, first of all, everyone has a cell phone. Texting capability was huge, and they're moving their goods around different parts of where they are. And many of them were now accessing little craft portals, and were selling their goods to other towns they never would have reached 5 years ago. Now, is that high tech? It's not inventing the next Facebook, but it's tech-enabled. Don Graham, when I ran the Post, asked me, it was a brilliant idea, and I probably benefited more than he did. But he asked me if I would go to Korea and Japan 7 years ago and just immerse myself in these amazing broadband and mobile societies. And I was expecting, Star Wars. You get off the plane and lights are flashing and someone picks you up and you fly away. And I was so expecting to see everything technology in a society that I was completely unprepared to see nothing. And what I mean by that is technology had become like electricity or water. It just had simply become assumed. It wasn't a thing to put in a bucket. It was just part of the day-to-day. And what I've been seeing over there is whether it's as simple as dumb phones or more, that the people that you describe in the middle are tech-enabled. They may not be, again, starting the great new software, but they're using it to do things for themselves that was never available to them before. That, to me, is the interesting thing to watch.
Great. Well, I want to bring in the online audience. So, Colin, if we've got something on our Dean's Discussion hashtag.
Is it working?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we have a couple from Twitter. The first one is, when did you decide to be an entrepreneur? Was there a catalyst or key movement that influenced your decision? And the second one is, could you give some thoughts on the impact of these startups on international politics in general, especially in light of the Arab Spring and the role that social media played in it?
Right. I don't know if there ever was a time that I thought of myself as an entrepreneur, except in hindsight. You just start doing stuff. I actually, it's not up yet, and I will save the punchline, or I'll keep the punchline very simple. But the LinkedIn guys asked a bunch of us to write pieces about our first job, and my first job was an entrepreneurial job. I was actually a DJ. And so I leave it at there. This pisses me off that people laugh every time I say this. In fact, that's the first thing that I said in the thing. And so thank you for your consistency. But I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I thought I loved music, and I loved doing parties, and I made money. And so you didn't think about it that way. And what was interesting was a little bit, I'm the grandson of Italian immigrants, right? Amazing lawyers. My mother was a lawyer at a time when there were not a lot of women in law school. And so she was, in a way, very much an entrepreneur. But we didn't think of ourselves that way. And so I went through a lot of classic traditional places. And in that journey, I just didn't feel comfortable in my own skin. I didn't like having to sort of figure out politics and stuff like that. And at some point, it just dawned on me that, wow, particularly, for example, when I ran the online stuff at the Washington Post and Newsweek, I was an intrapreneur. I didn't want to have to explain where the future was going within an organization, as important as it was to do that. You needed to do that, but I didn't want to do it. And I think at that point, it was crystal clear to me I would go a path that would allow me to get very, very smart people around me and just move in a direction. And I'm telling you that, entrepreneurship, we like to think life is an arrow, but a great entrepreneur here in town, David Bradley, once said something that I wish someone had said to me in my 20s. Life is a sine wave, man. It is not an arrow. It can be an arrow, and a sine wave hopefully arches up. But this is entrepreneurship, and this is life, I would argue, even in the fat lane. What matters is when you're down here, what does it look like to get up here again? And that's what tells you, about life and what you do. And so that's what I love that, and I love to be able to have some control in getting back to it and hopefully making impact with things that have never been there before. And that the idea of building things that were never there before, to me, was the real final passion where I began to associate myself being an entrepreneur as well. And the second question?
The international politics.
So, look, it's again, in a lot of respects, I think that when historians come back and look at this period, they're going to look at this period as a battle or conflict or coexistence with tension between the 20th century top-down institutions and the 21st century bottom-up empowerment. And empowerment sounds like a cliche because people throw that word around, but my last company was an online health company, and I saw empowerment every single day in the millions of people who came to it. And it fundamentally was about courage. And it was the ability to say, I'm not alone, I'm not crazy, and the actions I take can work because someone around me did them and it works. It's sort of elimination of fear. I mean, I think one of the big stories, you'd have to correct me on this if you feel differently, but I think one of the big stories about the Arab uprisings is that people are no longer afraid of the top-down institutions, which doesn't mean that the top-down institutions can't do terrible things, but psychologically, it's like you never go back, right? I don't see how you ever go back. It's like once you use good technology, you don't go back to old technology. Once you have a determination that in fact you could do something and have impact in it, even if it doesn't go in that straight line, even if it's in the low end of a sine wave, I think that changes everything. And I think that governments and institutions are going to have to realize that there's a different game being played than what they're trained to do. I mean, I go to a lot of think tank groups here, and I listen to speeches as long as I can tolerate them and all. And it's amazing how many of them sound like 1989. I mean, it's amazing, really. You know, these grand deals and these bargains and who's up and who's down, and it doesn't have real ramification in terms of the way things move, and it doesn't have ramification on real people's lives. And so people are saying it's going to be different. So I think government can play actually an incredibly powerful role, but a lot of it's not sexy. A lot of it, frankly, is getting out of the way. So I'm going to give you a little example from the U.S. perspective, but it's illustrative, I think. Great entrepreneurs from Egypt were invited to pitch their idea to some very, very good Silicon Valley venture capitalists. Anyone in America with a tech idea would have given their left foot to be able to get one of these meetings. And the venture capitalists said, but we're looking at competitors. You're not the only one doing this, and we're emphasizing enough. You got to get to the state. We're not doing this over Skype. You got to get here by June. This was in April. But you got to get here by June. Time is up. So they went down to the embassy and said, we need to get a visa. This is very important. Explain why. And the embassy said, that's great. Come back in August, and we'll have an interview. And that's all government, right? So my view is there's unbelievably mind shift that can happen and actions. I don't know if I can't prove this. Someone told me in the State Department alone, there's 17 different groups doing global entrepreneurship. And even if it's more than 10, I mean, what the hell is that? So there are a lot of just sort of basic things about that engagement that I think success breeds success there as well. But it's going to be tough.
Well, Chris, it's been an incredibly rich hour. I'm just so delighted that we were able to do this as part of All-American Weekend, to have the alumni here, to have parents here, to have students here. I can't help but notice that of the staff who came, they're my most entrepreneurial staff, so I think there's some connection there. And I just want to say congratulations on the book. It's right outside, available for purchase and signing. So thanks again.
Thanks, Jim. This is good. Thank you a lot.